A child does not learn about poverty by looking at a bank statement. They do not comprehend the mathematics of a deficit. They absorb it directly through the autonomic nervous system of their parents. Poverty is never an economic bracket. That is a convenient societal illusion. But here is the brutal physical reality. Poverty is a chronic, physically transmissible neurological condition. It infects the biological baseline of survival. It dictates human behavior entirely. This happens before a single financial decision is ever consciously made. Watch closely how they react. A mother stands perfectly still in a grocery aisle. She is reviewing a printed receipt. Her breathing instantly becomes shallow and rapid. The oxygen shifts entirely to her upper chest. Her jaw tightens until the masseter muscles lock. She subtly angles her physical body. She creates a barrier to block her 7-year-old child from seeing the total. The child's nervous system registers this threat immediately. They detect the mother's sudden muscular rigidity. They process the complete absence of eye contact. The child is holding a $2 item in their hands. Their brain forces them to quietly lower it back to the shelf. They place their hands rigidly into their pockets. They physically mirror the exact somatic tension of their mother. No words are ever exchanged. The transmission of biological panic is entirely silent. The actual fatal mechanism is what happens next. Why does this single, silent moment of suppressed desire matter? It permanently alters the physical architecture of that child's brain. It completely rewires the neural pathways of risk and reward. It guarantees a specific biological outcome. Decades later, they will make mathematically incorrect decisions. They will consciously sabotage their own survival. And it gets worse. They will do it because their nervous system demands it. Poverty forces the human brain into a perpetual state of immediate threat assessment. It is an unyielding alarm system. It completely strips the individual of their biological capacity to execute long-term strategic planning. You cannot plan for a decade when your brain is fighting to survive the next hour. The actual fatal mechanism is what neuroscientists call the Scarcity Tunneling Effect. Chronic financial deficit does not register as a simple math problem. It registers as a continuous, lethal environmental threat. This triggers the amygdala and locks the brain into a permanent state of hyper-arousal. To sustain this extreme hypervigilance, the brain must make a brutal metabolic trade off. It forcefully diverts glucose and oxygen away from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It drains the exact region responsible for impulse control. It starves the circuits required for complex problem solving and delayed gratification. We can map this cognitive bandwidth as a strict mathematical formula. Available equals E total Ti 550. Summed I1 circumflexins I found times WII. Your available cognitive energy equals your total energy baseline, minus the sum of every immediate survival stressor. Rent, food, and transit are each multiplied by a disproportionate cognitive weight. A weight assigned by a panicked amygdala. As the sum of these weighted stresses approaches your total energy, the system breaks. The capacity for rational computation completely collapses. This results in an immediate, measurable drop in fluid intelligence. Watch closely how they react. A man sits alone at a kitchen table. He is surrounded by final notice utility bills. He does not pick up the phone to negotiate a standard payment plan. Instead, his pupil dilation rapidly increases. He begins to rhythmically tap his heel against the leg of his chair. He picks up his phone and opens his banking app. He stares directly at the negative balance. He holds his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he swipes out of the app. 5 seconds later, he opens it again. He repeats this action over and over. His motor actions are entirely cyclical and completely non-productive. He is physically mimicking a trapped biological state. But here is the brutal physical reality. This man will soon select an objectively detrimental financial option. He will accept a payday loan with a 400% interest rate. Society will call this a lack of intellect or a moral failure. Society is wrong. He makes this choice because his prefrontal cortex is metabolically starved, rendering long-term consequence analysis biologically impossible. This acute cognitive paralysis is highly destructive. And it gets worse. What happens when this hyper-aroused state refuses to deactivate? What happens when it permanently alters the physical structure of the nervous system itself? Generational poverty is not inherited through a lack of trust funds. It is passed down through a chronically deregulated nervous system. A childhood defined by scarcity physically rewires the brain. It forces the biological hardware to process stability as a physiological threat. Hope becomes a dangerous anomaly. The actual fatal mechanism is allostatic overload. Prolonged exposure to unpredictable financial stresses triggers a massive endocrine response. The adrenal glands begin continuous, uninterrupted secretion of glucocorticoids. Specifically, toxic levels of cortisol flood the bloodstream. This is not an emotional state. This is a sustained chemical assault on the neural architecture. Sustained cortisol physically degrades the dendritic networks in the hippocampus. This is the exact brain region critical for learning and memory retention. The hippocampus physically shrinks under this biochemical pressure, but here is the brutal physical reality. While the memory centers atrophy, other regions are aggressively upgraded. The neural pathways connecting the amygdala to the motor response system are heavily myelinated. They are structurally strengthened for instant activation. The brain optimizes itself to expect immediate disappointment. It establishes a baseline where comfort registers as an active danger. Watch closely how they react. A teenager from a low-income household is handed an unexpected $100 cash reward. This is for an academic achievement. Their facial muscles do not relax. They do not smile. Instead, their heart rate visibly spikes. You can see the rapid, forceful pulsing of their carotid artery against their neck. They immediately fold the paper bills tightly. They walk rapidly and silently to their bedroom. They place the cash inside a shoe, pushed far beneath their bed. For the next 48 hours, they exhibit extreme hyper-vigilant scanning behavior. They dart their eyes toward the door every time a family member approaches the room. They are guarding against the inevitable extraction, and it gets worse. The brain becomes biologically intolerant to positive outcomes. Opportunities for advancement trigger severe autonomic distress. The accumulation of wealth causes physical panic. Moments of peace induce acute anxiety. This happens because the nervous system has written a specific predictive code. It strictly equates the state of having with the imminent, painful physical threat of losing. When human biology physically equates success with danger, a secondary trap engages. The surrounding social hierarchy steps in to validate this exact fear. It transforms a physiological stress response into a permanent, inescapable identity. Poverty does not crystallize into an inescapable destiny purely through a lack of resources. The actual fatal mechanism is social validation. External deprivation must be repeatedly confirmed by human interaction. It is systematically internalized as a permanent defect in human worth. Humans are evolutionarily wired to constantly monitor their status within a hierarchy. This is an autonomic, involuntary survival function. Being visibly deprived in a social setting triggers the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. This is the exact same neuromatrix that processes acute physical pain. A broken bone and a severe drop in social status register identically on an fMRI scan. Then, learned helplessness completely paralyzes the biological system. An individual makes repeated, desperate attempts to exert control over their environment. They continuously collide with insurmountable systemic barriers. In response, the brain actively ceases all voluntary escape behaviors. The striatum deliberately decreases dopamine production. It stops reacting to potential rewards. It cements a concrete neurological belief. Human action has zero impact on environmental outcomes. Effort is categorized as a waste of metabolic energy. Watch closely how they react. A first-generation college student attends a high-status university networking event. They are wearing an outdated, poorly tailored suit. A visibly wealthy peer approaches them. Within 0.5 seconds, the student completely breaks eye contact. They physically hunch their shoulders forward. They aggressively attempt to minimize their spatial footprint in the room. They consciously and deliberately suppress their own vocabulary. They cross their arms tightly over their chest. They force themselves to speak in short, flat, monotone sentences. They are actively trying to terminate the interaction. They must escape prolonged exposure to avoid the physical pain of social evaluation. But here is the brutal physical reality. This single interaction scales into the complete cessation of all upward mobility efforts. The individual begins systematically negotiating their own worth, down to zero. They will willingly accept substantially lower salaries. They will remain compliant in abusive, degrading personal relationships. They will actively refuse to apply for higher professional positions. They do this because the neurological anticipation of social rejection is agonizing. The fear of this pain vastly outweighs any biological desire for improvement, and it gets worse. What happens if an individual somehow forces their way through this suppression? What if they override their own biology and actually accumulate wealth? They immediately encounter the most devastating psychological defense mechanism of all. Physical and financial escape from poverty is rarely the end of the war. It frequently triggers a massive, subconscious self-sabotage. The human brain will aggressively dismantle newfound wealth. It will deliberately destroy stability to return to a neurologically familiar state. The actual fatal mechanism is repetition compulsion. This is not a psychological weakness. It is a strict neurobiological phenomenon. The brain operates entirely on predictive coding models. It vastly prefers familiar chaos over unpredictable peace. Processing a new, stable reality requires immense metabolic energy. Processing the familiar panic of scarcity requires almost none. The entire ego structure of this individual was built on the identity of lacking. When suddenly presented with financial abundance, the biological system crashes. The nervous system experiences severe psychological tension. To resolve this devastating cognitive dissonance, the brain takes immediate action. It actively orchestrates highly specific behavioral failures. It forces the external reality to realign with the internal perception of unworthiness. Watch closely how they react. A newly promoted executive receives their first six-figure bonus check. They were raised in severe, generational poverty. Within 2 hours of the direct deposit, they open a web browser. They navigate directly to an online luxury retailer. They spend exactly 45% of the bonus on a single watch. They had absolutely no prior intention of making this purchase. During the checkout process, their palms physically sweat. Their respiratory rate sharply accelerates as they click confirm. And it gets worse. The following week, they intentionally skip lunch for 3 consecutive days. They force their stomach to completely empty. They systematically recreate the precise physical sensation of hunger. They meticulously reconstruct the somatic panic of financial deficit. The outcome is the cyclical, deliberate destruction of resources. The individual will continuously drain their own bank accounts. They will violently ruin stable professional relationships. They will take irrational, completely uncalculated risks. They do this to guarantee one specific outcome. They must return to the exact baseline of scarcity, because that is the absolute only state their nervous system recognizes as home. The societal narrative of meritocracy is a statistical manipulation. It is deliberately designed to mask the reality of biological determinism. They tell you that hard work guarantees success. That is a mathematical lie. Poverty is not a temporary lack of funds. It is not a character flaw. It is a meticulously inherited neurological war zone. To tell a person raised in generational poverty to just work harder is absurd. It is a demand that they physically hustle their own prefrontal cortex. You are operating within an asymmetrical system. You are fighting a literal war against your own physical brain structure. Realizing this fact is the only way to shatter the programming. But here is the brutal physical reality. You must never rely on willpower. Do not rely on motivation or positive thinking. You must treat your financial recovery as clinical neurological rehabilitation. First, you must audit your autonomic responses. Document your exact physical sensations. Track your heart rate, your muscle tension, and your breathing depth. Do this precisely at the absolute moment you spend or receive money. Second, you must bypass the amygdala via systematization. Automate every single financial transaction. Automate the savings transfers. Automate the bill payments. Remove the physical act of decision making entirely. Do not give your brain the opportunity to trigger a threat response. Third, you must desensitize the shame reflex. You must force somatic exposure. When entering high-status environments, consciously uncross your arms, pull your shoulders back and lock your physical posture. Maintain eye contact for exactly 3 seconds longer than your anxiety dictates. Force the brain to process the external data. Force your nervous system to realize the room is not a physical threat. If you are ready to stop fighting the ghosts of your upbringing, if you are ready to systematically reprogram your biological hardware, hit subscribe. We do not deal in motivation here. We deal in reality.